Good evening. Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight for North Coast Land Conservancy's On the Land series. I'm Lynette Villagomez, NCLC Outreach Manager, and I'm joining you from Seaside. For those of you who are less familiar with North Coast Land Conservancy, North Coast Land Conservancy is a nationally accredited private nonprofit land trust working since 1986 to conserve and connect the landscape of the Oregon coast from the Columbia River to northern Lincoln County by acquiring and managing lands for their habitat and cultural values. Currently, North Coast Land Conservancy owns more than 50 conservation properties and over a dozen conservation easements. North Coast Land Conservancy works to ensure that this extraordinary region is a place where healthy communities of people, plants, and wildlife can all thrive. Currently, North Coast Land Conservancy is underway on its biggest project yet. We are nearing the end of a campaign to raise funds to acquire a 3,500 acre property we call the Rainforest Reserve. The Rainforest Reserve serves as the backdrop for several North Coast communities in Clatsop and Tillamook counties. The Rainforest Reserve is a coastal landscape of epic proportions. The salt cliffs rising high above the rugged shoreline below, and these mountains have been home to an abundance of rare and diverse plants and wildlife. Beyond its natural magnificence, these forested mountains play an invisible role in sustaining our everyday lives, cleaning the air we breathe and purifying the waters for neighboring coastal communities. To find out more about this project and North Coast Land Conservancy's work, visit nclctrust.org. And this evening, presenter Mike Patterson will be discussing some of the flora and fauna one might encounter in the Rainforest Reserve. Mike Patterson is a biologist, educator, and professional counter of things: birds, butterflies, moths, flowers, amphibians. Mike lives in Astoria and blogs about birds and more. Mike, thank you for taking the time to show us some of the wonders of the Rainforest Reserve. I'll let you take over.
Well, thank you everybody for coming here tonight. I'm going to do my, I'm going to roll the credits at the beginning, because if you're like me toward the end, when it starts to sound like it's wrapping up, you get up and go to the bathroom. So I want to make sure that that I am clear about this. Most of what you're going to see tonight, I may have taken the pictures, I may have been in the room when it happened, but a lot of this stuff really depended on a lot of help from other people, including the North Coast Land Conservancy, who has been wonderfully indulgent in letting me bang around on their properties. And that would include Lynette here, and Katie and Melissa and Eric and John. I also need to give a shout out to Kathleen Sace, who has most of what I know about botany is really just cribbing off of what she showed me. Celeste Lebo was a lot of help. Steve has been my partner in crime for, oh gosh, 15, 20 years now. Lee Kane, who I worked with at the high school back before I stopped teaching, has also helped me a lot. He's especially useful with fish. Doug Ray, I don't think Doug Ray is here tonight, but boy howdy, Doug Ray was a pretty important part of my being able to get around. And of course, you'll probably see some of Tom Horning's fingerprints around as well. And then I think the person that I need to thank the most is Neil Main. I don't think any of us, well, I'm sure we wouldn't be having this meeting tonight without Neil Main. So, and Neil Main has been probably one of the most important personal mentors to me of my life. And so I don't see Neil's name out on the list here, but if he watches the video later, hi Neil. So we're going to go ahead and get started here, which means I have to figure out how to share the screen. So we're going to do that and that, and there we go. So anyway, we're going to talk about the Rainforest Reserve today, but we need to talk about it in context. It really is part of a much larger system. You're seeing right here, I'm standing on the top of Wikia, which is one of the, which is the peak, which is associated with the Astoria watershed. And in the background there, you can hear, or you can see Saddle Mountain, and what do we got here? Sugarloaf and Green Mountain, and of course, Onion Peak and Angora in the background, and just a little tiny bit of Tillamook Head and Cape Falcon. So we're gonna jump around here because, as I said, the Rainforest Reserve is part of a much larger system, and it really makes more sense if we look at the whole system rather than just its parts. And so we're going to start with a quote from the poet-philosopher Donald Rumsfeld about what we know and what we don't know. It's kind of, it has meaning, even though it may not be the meaning that Donald Rumsfeld actually did. So we're going to start in the past. 17 to 7 million years ago, there were some pretty impressive volcanoes on the border between Washington and Idaho that spit out a whole bunch of lava. That lava went flowing down through the Columbia Gorge and made it all the way to what is now the Columbia River estuary. And that lava flow shapes what we see here in the lower Columbia when it comes to looking at the Rainforest Reserve and the other systems that are associated with it. We also know that it rains a lot here, and if you look at the rainfall figures for the Oregon West Coast, it actually matches the Olympic Peninsula more than it matches other parts of the Oregon coast. And this distinction, this connection to the Olympic Peninsula is kind of important when we start looking at what's going on in our Rainforest Reserve. The peaks in and around the lower Columbia are not huge by Rocky Mountain standards, but compared to the landscape around them, they are quite tall, and they actually wrap around the lower Columbia. I don't have any of the Washington peaks on here, mostly because I don't know much about them. I haven't, access to that side of the system is more complicated than it is on our side. And as a consequence, I don't know a lot about the rocky high peaks of the Washington side, but they have the same common origin. And I suspect that with some exploration, we would find a lot of similarities to that system, to the system that we're going to be looking at today. So if you look at all of these peaks in context, they run up and around, and as I said, into Washington, and they represent a collection of microhabitats which set them apart from the lower areas around them. And we can kind of think of these as islands in an archipelago. They're surrounded by different habitat, and the organisms and plants and animals and other things that we find up there are isolated in the way that islands in an archipelago would be isolated. This creates some unique flora and fauna, which much of which is associated with well, the Ice Age from about 15,000 years ago and beyond that. The first European explorers to come to the Columbia River were mostly interested in how they could make money. And we really don't start seeing scientific curiosity about the lower Columbia in much of the writings until we get to the Wilkes expedition of about 1841. And he noted that the Coast Range peaks around the Columbia, the mouth of the Columbia, well, he wasn't impressed with them. They weren't tall enough for him. They weren't spiky enough for him, I guess. But one of the things that we do discover in this description is the word Swallalahos, which is what the indigenous people of the area called Saddle Mountain. This is the drawing that he made in 1841, Mount Swallalahos, and which was also called Saddle Hill. It also has a French name, which basically is the French word for Saddle Mountain. Later on, we get to another account by Joel Palmer, and in that account, we get a description of an encounter between what Joel Palmer described as the Great Spirit and the people of the Tillicum people. And essentially, the Great Spirit got mad, set the mountain on fire, turned all of the people into stones, and cast them out into the ocean. And eventually, he chilled out and removed the fire to a word here, Sa La Ilahi. And I find that very similar to the word Swallalahos. We look at the word Sa La Ilahi and the word Saghala Ilahi, which is another word that we find among indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest. And then we compare that to Swallalahos. I suspect what Swallalahos is telling us is the same thing that these other two words are telling us, and it's James Dana's translational approximation of what the Chinookan and Clatsop people of the Lower Columbia would have called Saddle Mountain, which is Swallalahos or something close to that. We may never know. What we can say is that that is probably the most logical etymology of the word Swallalahos. You'll hear other people who've seen on the internet other descriptions, and of course everything on the internet is true. So it's hard to know what is what, but for my money, this seems like a pretty coincidental, more than coincidental approximation of the other two words, which basically mean high mountain place. And I don't think any of us are going to argue that these high places that surround the Columbia River are sacred places. And so I think that even if I'm wrong, this is my story, and I'm going to stick to it, that Swallalahos means high sacred place. And with that, we start for approaching our exploration of the rocky region that surrounds the Lower Columbia. If we take this geographical area and we bind it together because of its unique features and climatological conditions, we start to see a biological and ecological landscape that we can call a floristic province. And And when Kathleen and I were banging around this idea of trying to unify the biology of this area, we figured that calling it the Swallowlahos floristic province seemed like the logical way to start describing this. And if you're interested in Kathleen's arguments on this, you can go to the library and get the 2010 copy of Kalmiopsis, where she discusses this at length. So we're going to start our exploration of these places with this idea that we are looking at a connectivity between these sites that is associated with their geology, their climate, the cultural history that goes back to the indigenous people. All of these things together combine to inform our explorations of the area. So we're going to count all of these places. This is Cape Falcon, part of the Neoconi complex, which goes right out into the ocean. And it pins the southern edge of this big ring of rocky peaks that surround the lower Columbia. On the other, the pin at the other end would be Cape Disappointment on the other side of the Columbia River. We have the Angora complex, which is just upslope from Cape Falcon. The Onion Peak complex. Sugarloaf Mountain, which Carla Cole and Melissa and I had a chance to go up and look for rare plants up there a couple of years ago. That was fun and exciting. And there are stories associated with that crawling through the underbrush to get to this place was, well, I'm a large person and it was quite the adventure. This is Kidder Butte. You'll notice that Kidder Butte is also in my background today. Then we have Humbug, Saddle Mountain, Wickiup Mountain, and Nicolay Mountain. These make up the tallest of the Oregon side Rocky Peaks. Some of them, Oswald West State Park, Saddle Mountain, are both under the management of the Oregon State Park System. Saddle Mountain is a state natural area, and so they have considerable protections. Most of Onion Peak and a good chunk of Angora Peak, once the North Coast Land Conservancy has finished their purchase, will also be under protection. Sugarloaf, Humbug, Kidder are all under private ownership from timber industry. Wickiup depends on which side of the road you're standing on. One side is timber industry, the other side is the Astoria watershed, and then Nicolay Mountain here is part of state forestry. And so various stakeholders, various levels of protection and management for all of these different peaks, and but none of them has escaped at least some timber management over some part of their history. In fact, if you look at the history of both sides of the Columbia River, we've put a lot of energy into focusing on trees, so much so that we may be losing the forest in the process, because it takes an ecosystem. A forest is more than the trees. And I don't think that statement is particularly controversial. So we're going to do some vocabulary work here to start with, so that we can understand how we're identifying these things. We humans like to put stuff into boxes and categories and make decisions that are important to humans And vocabulary is one of those things. So let's start with endemic. What does endemic mean? Well, this is the frigid shooting star, Dodecathion austrofrigidum. It is only found in the northwest corner of Oregon. There are a couple of sites in Washington too, but for the most part, its range is very, very limited. And when you find a plant which is limited to a very specific area, the technical term for that is endemic. So the frigid shooting star is endemic to the lower Columbia River. You can't find it anywhere else in the world. And that makes it a species of concern. And so the state of Oregon has laid out a ranking system for what that means. And it is pretty straightforward. We use it when we do assessments to because there's specific species that we want to be able to say are in this spot that we would be protecting if it was under our management. And so you've got critically imperiled, imperiled, rare, but not immediately imperiled, but it could be imperiled, not rare, and apparently secure, but long-term concern. And then we have demonstrably widespread, and then some other letters too. And then the one at the bottom here, which I find the most frustrating, not yet ranked. But anyway, you can download the all of the list of all the critters and plants and things that are have been ranked by the Oregon Natural Heritage Information Center, and I will be using it. You'll see this designation on many of the plants and animals that we'll be looking at today. If you look at plants specific to our area, Saddle Mountain bittercress is a S2 regional endemic. And you can go to the Consortium of Pacific Herbaria, and they have a map, and you'll notice that the only boxes that are colored in for that are in the northwest corner of Oregon. It is a very rare regional endemic. This is the Saddle Mountain bittercress, Micranthes hitchcockiana. It's an S1, very sensitive species. And again, if you look at the boxes, it's only in the northwest corner of Oregon, Saddle Mountain, Onion Peak, Angora, and King Mountain in this case, in Tillamook County. Queen of the Forest, Philopendulum occidentalis, another rare endemic. It's a little more widespread. You can find it from Washington down into Lincoln County in High Peak areas. And it has some very, very specific habitat requirements associated with moisture and the substrate that it grows out of. Then we have some other plants which, for reasons which are associated with the Ice Age, have weird distributions. This is Cladothamnus pyroliflorus. And if you look it up, there's a different genus name, but I haven't bothered to learn the other genus name. I like Cladothamnus, and I'm sticking with that name. Anyway, if you look at the distribution of that one, you find that there's a whole bunch of it in the northwest corner of Oregon. And then if you want to find any more, you have to go way up into the Olympic Peninsula and British Columbia to find more of it. So it is a disjunct population, again, associated with the similarities between our climate and the climate of the Olympic Peninsula and British Columbia. And it's an Ice Age remnant. And we have a plant called prairie smoke, Geum triflorum. There's actually two different varieties of prairie smoke. And if you look at the map here, you find that most of the prairie smoke and east of the Cascades. And then all of a sudden you find some in our northwest corner and then up in the Olympic Peninsula, and that is a different regionally distinct species, and so it actually has a different S number than the rest of the prairie smoke. And this brings us to our first real mystery, something we don't have all the answers to yet. There are actually at least six kinds of Castellacea in our area. Two of them are associated with coastal dunes, and these four are associated with rockier terrain. The Castellacea littoralis is fairly coastal. You find it at Neahkahnie Sea Cliffs. You can find it at Tillamookad and up at Cape Disappointment, but it's right against the ocean, and you don't find it much past that. Presumably, there's some climatological requirements which keep it from going any further uphill. And we have Castellacea miniata, which is scarlet paintbrush, and the only place you can find it, as far as I know, is on Saddle Mountain. Doesn't occur anywhere else in the county. Another Ice Age remnant that you'd have to go further east to find other examples of. And there's Castellacea hispida, which is the West Coast variety of one of the more widespread Castellaceas, and it's pretty easy to find in most of the rocky areas that surround the lower Columbia. And then finally, the star of the show, which is Castellacea chambersii, which is a regional endemic that's found only here on the lower Columbia. Now, I didn't know much about paintbrushes, but I do know a guy, and we were able to get him to come to Onion Peak and check out these plants. And he was the go-to person because he's actually the person who wrote the biological description for the plant. But as I remember correctly, he hadn't actually been to Onion Peak to see any of these Castellaceas. He'd been to I think he'd been to Angora, but he hadn't been to Onion Peak. And so we were able to take him up Onion Peak Road, and we had a good time. We took pictures and we saw all sorts of examples of the plants, from the bright red ones to the sort of orangey ones to the more orangey ones to the yellow ones, come in lots of colors. And you really have to spend a couple of days looking through all the Chambers paintbrushes to really appreciate how many different colors they come into. And so anyway, we went up to Onion Peak and we saw all these things, and we, at least I, started getting full of myself. We started thinking, well, maybe we've got this plant figured out. Maybe we kind of understand its distribution and stuff. And then we got a phone call. May have been an email, but we got a message from the biologist at Weyerhaeuser. She'd found a plant in Washington that she thought was Chambers paintbrush. So Kathleen and Mark Ager and I got in the back of the pickup for the Weyerhaeuser biologist and went up to the place where she found it. And sure enough, there's Chambers paintbrush on the Washington side of the system as well. So there's Chambers paintbrush down in this lower corner here where Angora, Onion Peak, and Sugarloaf are. And then there are no Chambers paintbrushes as far as we know until you get to that spot up there in Washington. What that tells us is there's probably good reason to go up and spend some more time banging around up in the rocky, tall places in on the Washington side. The curious thing is there don't seem to be any Chambers paintbrush on Saddle Mountain or Humbug or Kidder's Butte or Nicolay Mountain. And we have gone to those places. Saddle Mountain, lots of people have gone there and nobody has been able to find it. So it is an interesting thing about these disjunct populations and how they pop up in places where we're not expecting. And it really brings home the importance of not getting too cocky and realizing that we know a whole lot less than we think we do. And Tom, if you're here, if you're out there in the chat world, this is what the rocky terrain looks like where that Washington Chambers paintbrush was. And I'm not a geologist, so I don't know what to make of that, but I bet you do. And so if you have any comments on that, go ahead and put them in the chat box. We have a really interesting system here with plants that you find them here, and then you have to go hundreds, or you have to go to the Cascades or up to Canada to find other examples of them. We have plants which are regional endemics that you don't find anywhere else. We have plants which are designated as very, very, very sensitive. We have plants that should be designated, at least in our area, as very, very sensitive, and they're not. We have plants which require very specific conditions in order for them to be happy and grow and survive in our area. We have plants which bloom early. We have plants that biologists or the botanists can't figure out what to call. I learned this is Sthenanthium occidentale. It's got another name now. And whenever I say Sthenanthium around botanists, many of them insist on correcting me. But I just like taking the pictures of them. I'm not a botanist, and I'll say that over and over again, but I sure like trying to get a nice picture. And so for me, my interest in these plants is different than what the interest might be for a botanist. And if you get too hung up on the plants themselves, you can fall into the same kind of myopia that people who only see trees for one particular purpose see. Which gets us to lupins. Another weird thing about the system here is, as far as I know, there are no lupins on Saddle Mountain. There are lupins just about everywhere else. There's 3 or 4 species, 4 or 5 species, I don't know how many species. There's a lot of lupin in other places. And part of what makes that mystery intriguing is that there are a lot of butterflies which depend on lupin as their host plant. And so if you don't have lupins, you don't have this suite of butterflies that we go looking for. So Saddle Mountain, it's a lot harder to find a silvery blue on Saddle Mountain. They'll eat other stuff, but it's a lot harder to find a silvery blue on Saddle Mountain, Waterval's blue, several other of these little blue butterflies that are lupin specialists. You don't find them there. And so there's a connection between these plants and other organisms that we really need to be aware of, because that connection is important. And if we're not really tuned in to every aspect of a butterfly's existence, or a plant's existence, or whatever, we can find ourselves making some mistakes that will come back to haunt us later. Most of these butterflies are very closely attached to certain groups of plant species. And so if you want to find a moss elfin, you have to find sedum. You have to find, in this case, this is sedum oreganum, but they do use other sedums in other locations. But around here, if you want to see a moss elfin, you need to find sedum. So there is a really important connection between these plants, between plants and animal species that is important, but it's also fun. If you like to take pictures of plants and you like to take pictures of butterflies, then you need to know about the relationships between plants and butterflies in order to get those pictures. There was a lot of work that was done on distributional biology back in the 60s and 70s that just kind of abruptly stopped in the mid 70s. And so a lot of the species that, butterfly species in particular, but also some of the plant species, because there weren't organized efforts to go out and look for them, they dropped out of our awareness. And the silver spot butterfly is a good example of that. There were silver spot butterflies flying over most of the lower Columbia, from the Long Beach Peninsula up into Saddle Mountain and down into the Clatsop Plains until the 90s. But we don't know when they disappeared from some of the places that they disappeared, because people weren't really watching until they were gone. This is the host plant for the Oregon silver spot butterfly. This is Viola adunca, and there's a lot of it around. There's plenty of it up on Saddle Mountain. You can find it on the Clatsop Plains. If you go out to the Long Beach Peninsula, there are spots where you can find Viola adunca. And so if there's plenty of Viola adunca, why are there no Oregon silver spots? Well, again, it takes more than a Viola adunca to make a silver spot happy. And so other parts of the ecology of the Oregon silver spot must have collapsed. And we don't know whether, we don't know what group of things caused this to happen. We have some suspicions, probably pesticide use, certainly development of some of the habitats, lots of things, but we really don't have a good idea of why the silver spot disappeared. However, starting about 3 years ago, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in cooperation with with Oregon State Parks, started a program up on Saddle Mountain to release caterpillars that were reared zoos in Portland and Seattle. These are silver spot butterflies, which trace their parentage back to Mount Nebo, and they were released on Saddle Mountain. And for the first time that we know of since the 1970s, we can find silver spot butterflies up on Saddle Mountain. The work isn't done yet. It's going to take several more additions of caterpillars to the system before the system becomes robust enough to be self-sustaining. But we hope that eventually that's what's going to happen, is that the silver spots will be self-sustaining up there. And there are also plans to reintroduce them in the Clatsop Plains as well. But that's another slideshow. When we start looking for connections between butterflies and the system around them, we find all sorts of interesting connections. This is a western tiger swallowtail. It is, the word I use is poopulating. This is a large pile of poop, and the butterfly is actually extracting nitrogen compounds that it needs to produce eggs by licking the nitrogen compounds which are associated with the poop here. And so we can make a connection between butterflies and big sexy megafauna, which is it's an important connection because it's easy to make the connection between a butterfly and its host plant. It's easy to make a connection between a butterfly and its nectaring species, pollinating species, stuff like that. But the butterfly is really connected to the entire system, and those connections are often left out in some of the planning that we do. Insect species are important pollinators, and that's been in the news a lot lately. We've been hearing a lot about pollinating species, especially bees, but almost any bug that you see on a flower is a pollinator. This is a flower beetle in the genus Prosternum that is a pollinator. And oftentimes we focus on the bug that we don't like, and we do things to that bug, particularly pesticide management of those bugs, without the understanding that the pesticide is not bug specific. If you're trying to get rid of gypsy moths, you're also affecting Oregon silver spot butterflies. You're affecting all sorts of other important species. If you're aiming at aphids, you're also aiming at the things that eat aphids, like ladybugs and beetle species and so forth. So again, there's this connection that we often, as humans, we don't make because we focus on one particular issue, one particular problem, one particular need, and that lack of holistic thinking often comes back and bites us. So we need to start thinking about these connections in a different way. The butterflies have host plants. The butterflies have needs, but so do the other insects that we encounter. This is a tachinid fly, which does not have a common name. It only has a Latin name, Xanthoepalpus bicolor. Most of these tachinid flies are pollinators. This one is busy pollinating tansy ragwort. Try not to hold that against it. It is a native fly, even though the plant that it's pollinating is not. But it also is an important pest control fly, because the tachinid flies, most of them lay their eggs in caterpillars, and without tachinid flies, the caterpillars go crazy, and you get too many caterpillars, and you start seeing some issues. And because the food chain tends to magnify poisoning issues, pesticide issues, as it goes up the food chain, these organisms that are higher up in the food chain can often be affected more seriously than the pests that you're trying to manage with the pesticides that you choose to use. Plus, insects are just cool, and take pictures of. They're pretty. I think they're pretty anyway. And so there's value at any level that you want to look at. You can find value even if you're not a botanist or an entomologist or whatever, in just the marveling in the prettiness of these organisms. Another really interesting bug that we have, which right now has only been seen in the Coast Range. It's only been seen in 3 different spots: Munson Falls, Saddle Mountain, and the best of the populations, which is up on Onion Peak. Black petal tail is called the Jurassic dragonfly, or the dinosaur dragonfly. The members of this family go all the way back to about 150 million years ago. It is a relic population in a whole bunch of senses. in order to find black petal tails elsewhere, you have to go to the Cascades. And so this is another one of those disjunct population issues that we keep finding in this ring of sacred peaks around the lower Columbia River. Black petal tails also exhibit a kind of biology called allochronic or allochronism, and the non-flying stage, what we call the non-adult stage, and it's with dragonflies. That's doesn't mean the same thing that it does with people. In the non-reproductive stage, they spend about 5 years as nymphs, and then they become dragonflies for 3 or 4 weeks, reproduce, lay eggs, and the whole cycle starts over again. But the interesting thing about that, and what allochronism is this idea that this year's dragonflies may be genetically distinct from next year's dragonflies, because there's a reproductive barrier based on timing. And so because the dragonflies this year are that were produced this year are going to be nymphs for the next 5 years, that means the next 4 years, the genetic mixing in those different years is going to be for that year only. This does a bunch of things. First of all, it creates a very interesting question from an evolutionary point of view as to, are these really, are these allochronic species, are they really separate species in those different 5 years or not? And I'm not a dragonfly specialist, so that's a question you'll have to ask them, and you'll probably get arguments. But the interesting thing is that you do have this temporal barrier to reproduction. What it also means is that different years may produce different numbers of dragonflies. So you would go out this year and see lots of petal tails, and you come back next year and you don't find very many petal tails. Well, why is that? That's because 5 years ago, there's something happened which kept that particular cohort of petal tails from reproducing. And so you go there, you find lots of petal tails, and you come back the next year, there's no petal tails, and you panic. What happened to all the petal tails? We don't know unless we go through these 5-year cycles to see exactly what's going on. There's a butterfly up on Saddle Mountain that's also allochronic, and but it's lost the even year group here in the lower Columbia. And you go to the Cascades, most of the butterflies show up in even years, but there are odd year cohorts as well. But here, the great Arctics that fly on Saddle Mountain only show up in odd years. You don't see them in even years because something a long time ago happened to that cohort that made them completely disappear. The other interesting thing is the only place you can find these even year cohorts anywhere else on the planet is up in British Columbia. And so again, it's another one of those examples of a disjunct population associated with our region. This is another interesting thing about black petal tails. Unlike other dragonflies, which breed in open water, mostly ponds, but also slow-moving rivers and such, the black petal tail actually lives in mud and moss. And so it has a very specialized habitat, which affects where you can find them. And here on the lower Columbia River, there aren't very many of these sepie places left, except the places that have been protected, like Onion Peak, Saddle Mountain. I had thought I might have found some on Nicolay Mountain, but then somebody came in and basically hosed that seep with pesticides because they were doing some road building and stuff. And and I haven't seen any petal tails there, and probably, or I never actually confirmed petal tail, but I haven't seen anything that even looked like a petal tail since, well, for about 10 years now. But these seeps are wonderful places. Not only are they great places for plants and petal tails, but they also provide a place for other vertebrates like these northern red-legged frogs. These were, I think, taken in that puddle. Not at that time. That was the same puddle. We visit that puddle just about every time we go there. And one of the times we were there, we saw these. One of the times we saw the petal tails. And that particular time there was when I was up, well, actually, Mark Hager's picture. But anyway, we got the northern red-legged frog, which is considered a sensitive species. And it is very sensitive in some places. Other places, it's pretty easy to find. Here on the Lower Columbia, well, we're probably contributing to that S4 description because northern red-legged frog is pretty easy to come by up here. Last week, Melissa and Amy and Eric and the new guy, name I've suddenly forgotten. It'll turn up in the, I'll remember it here shortly. We went up into Onion Peak, the west fork of Ecola Creek, looking for a mysterious salamander that Melissa had found that she thought might be something special. So we went up and looked for salamanders on purpose. This is what looking for some salamanders on purpose is. You need to find your inner 8-year-old and go out with little fish nets and turn over rocks and see if you can find anything. And we spent the day doing that, and we found some stuff. We found little baby Columbia torrent salamanders. This is what a torrent salamander looks like when it's an adult. It is an S3 species. We actually confirmed, because nobody had actually looked for tailed frogs in these upper systems with any kind of energy. And so these are the first coastal tailed frogs, Escapus truei, that have been recorded in the Onion Peak area. This is what a tailed frog looks like. This is what a tailed frog male looks like when it's an adult. That little appendage there is what gives it its name, but anatomically, that's not a tail. It's a reproductive structure. But anyway, tailed frog. But what we were looking for, what Melissa had hoped we'd found, was the Cope's giant salamander, which, when I first started looking for salamanders, was only known from 2 spots. It was known from Saddle Mountain, Fox Creek, and the Fox Creek area, and on Saddle Mountain, and Quartz Creek, which is up, milepost 27. You take a turn to the right and go down, and Quartz Creek is, the access to Quartz Creek is there. In fact, the first Cope's salamander that I ever saw away from Saddle Mountain, I saw with Lee Kane. We went out on my birthday trying to rediscover the creek population of Cope's giant salamanders, and we found them. And then these are both Saddle Mountain adult Cope's giant salamanders. One of the interesting things about Cope's salamanders is that they stay in the water. They don't. They go through. They have a process called pediomorpha, where they stay in the juvenile form. They become reproductive in the juvenile form, and they never lose their gills. They remain aquatic throughout their lives, and there's very, very few examples of terrestrial Pope salamanders. I don't think there's any here in the Lower Columbia. This was the distribution of the believed distribution of Cope's giant salamanders in around 2005. There is a population in the Olympic Peninsula. There's a population down here, and more of them in the Willapa Hillside, the north here. Again, the only known sites were Saddle Mountain and Quartz Creek. And then there's a population. There's actually two different genetically distinct populations in the Cascades. There's a Cascade one, and then there's a Columbia River one. So anyway, I had the opportunity to guide a genetic researcher named Craig Steele up to Fox Creek, and we collected samples of from some Cope's salamanders in Fox Creek, and he compared them to the rest of the Cope salamanders that he could find in other places. And what he found out was that Cope salamanders, not surprisingly, are related to the salamanders that you find in the Willapa Hills and the Olympic Peninsula, but they are reproductively isolated enough so that you can actually tell them apart genetically from any other kind of Cope salamander on the planet. And so you've got the Columbia River ones and the Cascade ones, and they've all been sequenced out. And so we know a lot more about Cope salamanders than we used to. But what we don't know is distribution. And so I spent 2 summers, trying to sort out Cope's giant salamanders from their cousins, the Pacific giant salamanders. Pacific giant salamanders have really big heads. They have fluffy gills. They have a dark line through their eye, which we call an eye bar. There's some differences in the relative length of the body to the head. So we have a Cope salamander, this is from the Astoria watershed on the left, and a Pacific giant salamander larva on the right. And you have to go out and flip rocks and net them and take pictures of them and try to figure things out. And as I said, I spent a couple of summers. All the little black dots are places that I looked, and all the big black dots are places where I found, or at least think I found, Cope's giant salamanders. And so in my effort to understand more about Cope's giant salamanders, I was able to, at least to my own satisfaction, expand the known range of Cope's giant salamanders. And the problem that you run into is that a picture by itself is not definitive proof when it takes genetics. And so even though I sent these points off to somebody, it wasn't good enough. It wasn't a slam dunk for, yes, those are Cope's giant salamanders. In the process of rereading all of the Cope's salamander stuff that's out there, to make sure that I was current in my thinking, I discovered this map, 2014. Basically, other people went out and tried to answer the same question. What is the range of Cope's giant salamanders? And it turns out, if you look at some of those dots that are down in this region right here, they're in places that I checked, and some of them are places where I didn't find Cope's salamanders. So somebody else went and checked these places out. I checked this place down here. This is in Tillamook County. I didn't find any Cope salamanders there. I checked this spot here, didn't find any Cope salamanders. And you'll notice that there are some places that I found Cope salamanders which aren't on this map. I don't know whether the folks looked in those places and didn't find them, or whether they didn't get to those places. But now we have secondary evidence that, in fact, the Cope's giant salamanders can be found not just at Saddle Mountain and Quartz Creek, but they are down as far as Tillamook County. And that spot right there is about where the peak is. I don't know whether you guys can see the arrow or not when I move it around. I hope so. I think I said it that way. But anyway, if you look right where Onion Peak should be there, we would predict that there are Cope salamanders there. And it's just a matter of spending enough time looking to show that there are Cope salamanders there. But there's a bigger mystery, and this is western toad. The last official record that I can find for western toad in our area is 1911. And this particular toad here was found, I found it at Mount Hebo, and before I'd found it, the last official record for Tillamook County was in the late 50s. Now, mostly what that means is that people weren't probably looking for toads. When I found this toad and posted it in the places where people who care about toads might find it, I got an email from somebody from the U.S. Forest Service who wanted me to give him tips on how he might go about looking for toads in the Siuslaw National Forest. And I said, well, you need to go out at night with flashlights, and you need to, probably what you want to do is you want to go look for old abandoned sump stations where they dug holes that would fill up with water for when they wanted to put out fires. They'd have these water sumps. Probably check out those places, and he did. And now there are lots of records in Tillamook County. For some reason, I didn't get the map on here. Tillamook County. Still no records for Clatsop County and the areas that we're interested in, except when Melissa, one of the things that Melissa was going to show me that we turned out we didn't have enough time to go see, was she had a pond that had some large black tadpoles in it. At the time, she asked me what a large black tadpole might be, and I said, well, the only black tadpole I can think of is tree frog, which would be very small. I had completely blanked out on the possibility of toads. I wasn't even thinking toads when she asked me the question, and it didn't occur to me until I was setting up this program that Melissa may well have actually seen the first toads in Clatsop County since 1911. And so we need to get back up to that pond where Melissa found these toads and see if we can confirm that for her so that she can put that feather in her cap. There are some other species that need to be on our radar. These are two other species that I haven't seen in the county, but they're supposed to be here. Red tree vole is an S3 species associated with mature forests. We don't have very many mature forests here, but hopefully we'll be building some. And the red tree vole is something that we would be whether it's around. I don't know how. They're an arboreal species. I don't know how one goes about surveying for arboreal mice. And so we will probably need to bring in some specialists for that, but it would be nice to know. The Humboldt flying squirrel, you may have known it as the northern flying squirrel. Well, it turns out that the northern flying squirrel and the Humboldt squirrel are two different species. Humboldt squirrel is a cryptic species in that you don't notice it until you look at the genetic makeup. And it was recently split out, probably 4 or 5 years ago. Humboldt flying squirrel, I know that Jay Rasmussen has him coming to his feeder, his bird feeder at Svensson Island. I think Lee Kane has seen them. I've never seen a flying squirrel yet, but I think I know how to find this one. I think it's a matter of putting out the right bait in the right places with some trap cameras, and I think we might be able to find some flying squirrels in some of the areas that we're interested in. Would be nice to know more about the distribution in these upper streams of coastal cutthroat trout. Coastal cutthroat trout has requirements, food requirements, in terms of the species that are growing in the creek that tell us something about the creek health just by the presence of the fish. The invertebrate structure is critical in these streams. They need to be cobbly. They need to have rocks, not too much silt. They need to have plenty of bugs to eat. Water needs to be cold and clear. And all of these things are things that you find in healthy working forests, forests that actually have most of the components of their working ecology. And if you have a system which is good for trout, then you're going to have a system that's going to be good for other species like this dipper here. Dippers eat a lot of the same things that trout do, and they eat trout, little tiny small feet trout, but they do eat fish as well. But dippers and if you have a stream that's got cutthroat trout in it, you've probably got a stream that's got dippers. And if you've got a stream with dippers, you've probably got a stream that's got cutthroat trout in it. So again, it's one of those things where we can use one species as a indication that the other species might be present, and then we can look to see what's going on. So we need to keep looking. And every time we go looking, we find something that we didn't expect to find. This is maidenhair spleen wart on Angora. We're expecting to find it. It's another one of these disjunct species. Turned up on one side, and then a few years later, we were able to find it on the other side of Angora. It's probably up on Onion Peak as well. It's just a matter of looking in enough places to find it. Every time we go looking, we find something interesting. Every time we find something interesting, it creates for us a memorable experience that we want to tell our friends about, that we recall every time we go visit the place. Remember where that pygmy owl was sitting up on Angora Peak. We get to see things that a lot of other people don't get to see. This is the Oregon Fettered Adder's tongue. It's actually pretty common on both Angora and Onion Peak, but most people don't get it in bloom. I know that one of the first pictures I ever posted of this, I got 2 or 3 comments back from botanists who say, wow, I've never seen this in bloom. And so we get to see things by paying attention that other people don't get to see, either because we have special access or because we're paying attention. And then there are things that just make me smile. Anytime I see a gray jay, it makes me happy. And it makes me happy for reasons which are broad as a birder, but I also have some personal reasons why gray jays make me smile. And those who are members of my family know what I'm talking about. We go to these places for different reasons. We go to these places to look at stuff, to take pictures, but we also go to these places to find solitude, serenity, quietness, grandeur, places to stop and think. And that's why we need them. We need them. They are important for reasons which have nothing to do with whether you name Stenonthium occidentalis right or not. They go to the spiritual side of our makeup. They are things that are just beautiful. They're things that make us smile. They're things that that we just need for reasons which have nothing to do with, or maybe everything to do with, biology and getting around. They mark the seasons for us. There are times of the year where you go to a place just to see a certain flower, which is only there during that time of the year. It's just a special encounter. And we just need these places for reasons which have different personal reasons for all of us. And so I will leave you at this point with the words of the great bard Mark Twain, who gives us this piece of advice. And we all need to look to the future and keep working. If you want to contribute to the database for any of the North Coast Land Conservancy properties, you can be a citizen scientist. You can take pictures of things and put them on Northwest Naturalist. You can put them on eBird. You can take pictures of butterflies and moths, and you can put them on the Butterflies and Moths of North America website. Ordinata Central is for dragonflies. Bumblebee Watch. I just discovered one the other day, which didn't make the slide here, which is just about frogs and toads. There are lots of places where you can contribute to the database while you're out enjoying the place. And with that, I think I will open it up for questions. Pretty quiet out there.
I'm trying to unmute myself here. I saw one question. Sorry, I'm changing my view here. Let's see. Mary Hayden asked, will NCLC's lands be open to the public to explore? Once NCLC acquires the Rainforest Reserve, which we hope to do within 2021, we will have recreational access. It will be limited to certain areas so as not to disturb the very sensitive habitat, and we'll provide maps and wayfinding for those who are visiting the property. Also to note is just that the Rainforest Reserve isn't directly accessible to like highways, Highway 101 specifically, and those gates. So people will have to be mindful of the other land that they have to cross in order to access the Rainforest Reserve. And we do hope that in the future we will have outings where we can invite people onto the land to learn more about the wonderful place that we're conserving and the flora and fauna that's up there. And hopefully next year, Mike will be leading some more on the land outings, actually on the land and not on Zoom. Let's see here. Lorraine asked, is the coat salamander an indicator species?
We don't know. What we run into in a lot of cases is we don't know enough about the species to know whether it's an indicator species or not. I would tentatively say that yes, I would, that there are, COPES has a fairly narrow suite of requirements in terms of water quality, in terms of substrate quality, in terms of water temperature, things like that. And the presence of Cope salamander does indicate a lot of useful things that we need to know. Is it an indicator species in the same larger sense that some other species would be? Probably not. I would say that the Pacific giant salamander is a better indicator species of stream quality, just because its range is a little broader, and so it's easier to find and easier to see in places. But certainly, if you find COPES, it tells you something really important about streams and water quality.
We have a question from Mary that says, do you see much Scotch broom in the Rainforest Reserve? And give us your opinion on this shrub. I see it advancing everywhere.
Yeah, and again, it depends. It depends on where you are. When we were up on Onion Peak, there were some places where we found Scotch broom where I can remember going up with groups of North Coast Land Conservancy people and cutting all the Scotch broom down, and some of it came back. It's spotty in some places, and it's actually pretty aggressive in other places. But for the most part, the Scotch broom is not as bad as it is in places like the Clatsop Plains, where you see acres and acres and acres of Scotch broom. It's certainly a more manageable problem in the reserve than it is in other places around the county.
Yeah, I've been up there myself to do some broom busting near Onion Peak, and that area wasn't too bad, but I'm sure in other disturbed places it might be a little more prolific. But also because of the topography of some of the areas in the Rainforest Reserve, it seems like there isn't a lot of human disturbance, and so that Scotch broom hasn't crept up to those places. Let's see here. Got some kudos for you, Mike. One from Michelle. Well done, Dad. Nice to hear about the things you enjoy, or her friends enjoyed your talk. Kathleen said, thank you. It's the next best thing to being up there. And Mark said, very nice, Mike. He enjoyed the presentation. Thanks for your efforts. Well, if no one else has any questions, we've got about 5 minutes left. We can all go outside and enjoy the sun that's left. And I just want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you so much, Mike, for your willingness to talk about all of these flora and fauna on all of our conserved lands. You always graciously accept our invitation. So we're really happy that you're willing to do this. And for those of you that want to learn more about the Rainforest Reserve, you can go onto our website, nclctrust.org, and also to learn about upcoming events and any timely news. And thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good evening.